The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and desperation. It was 1975, somewhere deep inside Kodak's Rochester headquarters, and Steve Sasson, 25-year-old engineer with thick glasses and thinner patience, was about to show his bosses something that would change photography forever. He placed a toaster-sized contraption on the table. Wires hung from it like exposed veins. The thing weighed 8 pounds and looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie, not a boardroom. "Gentlemen," Sasson said, his voice steady despite the sweat forming on his palms, "this is a filmless camera. It captures images electronically and stores them on a cassette tape." The silence that followed wasn't curiosity, it was dread. One executive leaned back in his leather chair, arms crossed like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. "Why?" he asked slowly. "Would anyone ever want to look at their pictures on a television set?" Another executive higher up the food chain, with a corner office that overlooked the city, shook his head. "This is cute, Steve. Really? But we're in the film business. We make billions selling film and paper. Why would we want to develop a product that would eliminate the need for both?" Sasson tried to explain. He talked about the future, about how digital would eventually become the standard, about how they could lead the revolution instead of being crushed by it. But the room had already decided. The camera was shelved. The patents were filed, and then buried in legal archives like classified government secrets. The future was locked in a drawer, and Kodak threw away the key. What Steve Sasson didn't know, what none of them knew, is that, this moment, this decision to kill their own baby, would cost Kodak everything. Not just money, not just market share, everything. $31 billion. An empire built over 131 years, gone. To understand how Kodak committed corporate suicide, you have to go back to when they were untouchable. In 1976, 1 year after Sasson's invention was rejected, Kodak controlled 90% of film sales in the United States. They weren't just dominant, they were the industry. When Americans thought about capturing memories, they thought about Kodak, the yellow boxes, the brownie cameras, the little red Andulo kiosks at every drugstore where you'd drop off your film and pray the photos turned out okay. Kodak wasn't a company, it was a religion, and film was its scripture. The business model was genius, almost diabolical in its simplicity. Kodak made cameras cheap sometimes. They'd practically give them away because they knew the real money was in the consumables. Every roll of film, every pack of photo paper, every chemical solution used in darkrooms across America. That's where the margins lived. That's where Kodak printed money. By 1988, Kodak employed 145,300 people worldwide. They had manufacturing plants on 4 continents. Their research labs produced more patents than almost any other company on Earth. The profit margins on film were obscene, somewhere north of 60%. Every time someone took a family photo, every time a tourist snapped a picture at the Grand Canyon, every time a wedding photographer loaded a new roll, Kodak got paid. It was the greatest business model in corporate history. Until it wasn't. By 1997, Kodak's market value peaked at $31 billion, but beneath the surface, the empire was already cracking. Steve Sasson's digital camera wasn't just a prototype, it was a prophecy, and Kodak leadership knew it. Internal memos from the 1980s documents that would later surface during the bankruptcy proceedings showed that Kodak executives understood digital photography would eventually replace film. They had the research, they had the technology, they had a 15-year head start on the competition, but they also had something more powerful than innovation. They had fear. Fear that digital cameras wouldn't require film, fear that their factories would become obsolete, fear that their entire supply chain built over more than a century would collapse overnight. So they made a choice. They chose to protect the past instead of building the future. While Kodak buried Steve Sasson's invention, the rest of the world was waking up. In 1981, Sony released the Mavica, the first commercial electronic still camera. It wasn't digital in the modern sense, but it was filmless. The writing was on the wall, spray-painted in neon letters, 10 feet high. Kodak responded by launching better film products. In 1986, they introduced the world's fastest color film. In 1988, they debuted a revolutionary single-use camera. These were good products, smart products, but they were products designed for a world that was already dying. Meanwhile, in labs across Japan and Silicon Valley, engineers who had never sold a single roll of film were designing cameras that didn't need any. By the mid-1990s, companies like Canon, Nikon, and Fujifilm were releasing consumer digital cameras. The quality was terrible, grainy images, low resolution, clunky interfaces, but they were improving, fast. Kodak executives watched this happening. They commissioned studies, they formed committees, they held strategy sessions in conference rooms overlooking the same campus where Steve Sasson had built his prototype 2 decades earlier. And then they did something astonishing. They tried to have it both ways. In 1991, Kodak released the DCS-100, a professional digital camera that cost $13,000 and was basically a Nikon film camera, body-bolted to a digital sensor the size of a lunchbox. It was impressive technology, but it was also proof that Kodak didn't understand what was coming. They thought digital photography would be a niche product for professionals and tech enthusiasts. They thought regular people would always want prints, would always need film, would always come back to the warm, nostalgic glow of analog photography. They were catastrophically wrong. Between 1999 and 2003, digital camera sales exploded. The technology improved so fast that even casual photographers could see the difference year over year. And here's the thing that gutted Kodak. People didn't want prints anymore. They wanted to view photos on screens, share them online, email them to relatives across the country. The entire business model, the camera's are chip but film is expensive model collapsed. Digital cameras didn't need film, didn't need photo paper, didn't need chemicals or darkrooms or any of the infrastructure Kodak had spent 131 years building. In 2003, Kodak's film sales dropped 15% in a single year. The next year, they dropped another 20%. The year after that, another 25%. The company that had printed money for over a century was hemorrhaging cash at a rate that would kill any normal business in months. But Kodak wasn't normal. They were too big to fail quickly, so they failed slowly, publicly, painfully. By 2005, Kodak's stock price was in freefall. The company started announcing layoffs, first hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. Between 2004 and 2007, Kodak cut more than 27,000 jobs. The factories that had churned out film for generations went silent. The yellow boxes disappeared from store shelves. The kiosks were dismantled, and Steve Sasson, the engineer who had invented digital photography in 1975, watched it all happen from the sidelines. He'd retired from Kodak in 2009, 3 years before the company filed for bankruptcy. In interviews, he never sounded bitter, just tired. Like a man who'd tried to warn a ship about an iceberg and watched it sink anyway. Imagine you're in that boardroom in 1975. You've just seen the future. You're holding the technology that could transform your entire industry. But embracing it means destroying everything you've built. Your factories, your supply chain, your profit margins, everything. Do you take the leap? Or do you protect what you have and hope the future takes longer to arrive than you think? Answer honestly in the comments. Because this isn't just Kodak's story, it's the story of every company that ever faced disruption and chose comfort over courage. On January 19, 2012, exactly 37 years after Steve Sasson built the first digital camera, Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The company that had once been worth $31 billion was now valued at less than $200 million. They owed creditors $6.75 billion. Their stock, which had traded at $94 per share in 1997, was now worth 37 cents. The bankruptcy wasn't a surprise. It was an autopsy of a death everyone had watched in slow motion. Kodak tried to pivot. They really did. In the 2000s, they invested billions in digital cameras, printers, and even medical imaging technology. But they were always late, always playing catch-up to companies that hadn't spent decades trying to protect a dying business model. By the time Kodak fully committed to digital, Canon and Nikon owned the professional market. Sony and Samsung dominated the consumer space. And then smartphones arrived and obliterated the standalone camera industry entirely. Apple's iPhone, released in 2007, had a better camera than most point-and-shoot digital cameras. By 2010, more photos were being taken on phones than on all dedicated cameras combined. Kodak had invented the technology that killed them, and then they'd spent 3 decades running from it instead of leading it. The bankruptcy proceedings were brutal. Kodak sold off thousands of patents, including many related to digital imaging, for $527 million to a consortium of tech companies including Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and Samsung. The supreme irony: those patents were worth billions. They covered fundamental technologies that every smartphone camera in the world still uses today. Kodak had owned the keys to the kingdom, and they'd sold them for spare change to pay off debts they'd accumulated by refusing to open the door. The patents covered everything from image compression to color processing to sensor technology. Every time you take a photo on your iPhone or Samsung Galaxy, you're using technology that Kodak invented and then gave away because they were too afraid to use it themselves. By September 2013, Kodak emerged from bankruptcy as a much smaller company focused on commercial printing and packaging. They still exist today in 2026, but they're a shadow, a ghost, a cautionary tale taught in every business school in the world. The Rochester headquarters still stands, but most of the campus is empty. The workforce that once numbered 145,300 is now approximately 4,600. As of January 2026, Kodak trades under the ticker KODK with a market capitalization of roughly $550 million, less than 2% of what they were worth at their peak. And somewhere in that building, gathering dust in a storage room, is Steve Sasson's original prototype. The 8-pound camera that captured images on cassette tape, the invention that could have made Kodak the most valuable company on earth. Instead, it became a tombstone. The story of Kodak isn't really about technology, it's about identity. Kodak didn't fail because they lacked innovation. They literally invented the thing that disrupted them. They had the smartest engineers, the best research labs, more patents than God. They failed because they couldn't let go of who they used to be. In the minds of Kodak leadership, they were a film company. That's how they saw themselves. That's how they defined success. And when the future demanded they become something else, they couldn't make the leap. There's a term in psychology called the sunk cost fallacy. The idea that we continue investing in something because we've already invested so much, even when it's clearly failing. Kodak didn't just fall victim to this fallacy. They built a cathedral to it. Every factory they'd built, every supply contract they'd signed, every relationship with retailers and film developers and chemical suppliers, all of it became a weight around their neck, pulling them down even as they tried to swim toward the future. And here's what makes the story so devastating. Kodak knew. They saw it coming. They had reports and projections and warning signs flashing red for 20 years. But knowing isn't the same as acting, and seeing the future isn't the same as having the courage to walk into it. The most haunting part of the Kodak story isn't what happened, it's what didn't happen. Kodak could have been Apple, they could have been Samsung, they could have owned the smartphone camera revolution, they had the patents, they had the talent, they had the capital. What they didn't have was the willingness to destroy their own golden goose before someone else did. In 2001, a mid-level Kodak manager named Don Strickland wrote an internal memo that was later leaked to the press. In it, he said, "We have the technology to dominate digital photography, but we're too afraid of what it will do to our film business. We're choosing to die slowly rather than risk dying quickly." That sentence contains the entire tragedy. Today, in January 2026, more than 1.8 trillion photos are taken every year. Almost all of them are digital. Most are taken on smartphones, and Kodak's the company that invented digital photography captures almost none of that market. Meanwhile, companies like Apple, Samsung, and Google are worth trillions. Their camera technology, built on the foundations Kodak pioneered, generates hundreds of billions in revenue. Steve Sasson, now 76 years old, occasionally gives talks about innovation and disruption. He's gracious, never bitter, but there's always a moment in his presentations when he pauses, looks at the audience, and says something like, "We had it first. We just didn't believe in it." That sentence contains the entire tragedy. Kodak didn't fail because they lacked vision. They failed because they lacked faith. Faith in their own invention. Faith that they could survive transformation. Faith that the future was worth more than the past. The lesson isn't just for corporations, it's for anyone who's ever clung to something comfortable while the world changed around them. Sometimes the thing that kills you isn't the competition, it's your refusal to compete with yourself. Your unwillingness to cannibalize your own success before someone else does. Kodak had the chance to eat their own business and become something greater. Instead, they starved while protecting a feast that was already rotting. That's the $31 billion lesson. That's the cost of choosing comfort over courage. If this story proved anything, it's that the biggest risk isn't taking a leap into the unknown. It's standing still while the ground crumbles beneath you. Kodak had everything. The technology, the talent, the head start. They just couldn't let go of who they used to be long enough to become who they needed to be. If you're facing your own moment of disruption in business, in your career, in your life, remember the engineer in the boardroom holding an 8-pound camera that nobody wanted? Sometimes the thing that looks like your biggest threat is actually your greatest opportunity. Join this community of people who refuse to let comfort kill their future. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Because the world doesn't reward companies that protect the past. It rewards the ones brave enough to invent the future, even if it means killing what they used to be.